Merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His Holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. First of all, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So I think the intention was really just to make sure that as people were following, and I got a little bit of feedback during the series of 10 lectures that were given during the 10 days of Ashura of Muharam, we just wanted to make sure that people have the opportunity to interact and ask for clarifications. I think, as usual, I try to, I guess my style or what I usually try to present is what I would like to hear from a lecturer, which is usually packed and concentrated and dense with information. So usually it means that there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of clarifications, and it's a lot of information to take into every lecture. So I don't know how much we can cover. I think in part two, it's not necessarily just about the information that is presented as much as it is an opportunity to discuss some of the themes and the topics with the hope that it's not only going to remain at the theoretical level. So it's not, as we said, an accumulation of raw information that we're looking for. The point from these gatherings, especially during the month of Muharram or the seasons, the spiritual seasons of Shahr Ramadan, Shahr Muharram, and pilgrimage, and so on and so forth, is also to create programs and projects that have social ramifications, and there are applications, concrete changes in our lives as individuals and as communities too. And although the theme may seem to have been, I think, a little bit more theoretical this time, because the theme revolved around knowledge and sources of knowledge, and assessing them and being careful with where they come from and what we do with the information, and that it's not only about raw information, but there's a spiritual dimension that has to always be there, or at least let's call it a moral dimension that has to accompany the information that we have. So all of that said, I hope that we have a little bit of time. I'll go through the questions that I received. Brother Kareem sent them to me just before a couple of hours ago before the gathering. So I'll try to go, and inshallah we have time to cover all of them. Before I start, allow me just to ask if we already, just to know, not necessarily to ask your question, but do you already know that you have questions that you want to ask? In that case, we may stop after maybe one or two questions. We may stop and take questions from you and go back to them. If anyone already knows that you have questions that have not been submitted, and you already know your question, just let me know right now. Just raise your hand or let me know that there's a question coming. Otherwise, I'll go through the question. Inshallah, we'll leave 10-15 minutes before the maximum time we have, so that if anything comes up while we're talking and you want to ask about it, or anything else you want to discuss, then inshallah we can cover it at the end. Okay, so I'll go through the order of the questions as I received them. I was going to maybe put them in order of what I think is more relevant or not, or what's more important or not, but I'm just going to go with it as they were presented to me in the same order, and inshallah we'll have time to cover all of them. So the order does not indicate anything. That's one thing. And the last point, and I think this one is important, and I usually try to always repeat this point, and this applies to this, and it applies to those of you who follow the aqa'id lessons, the theology lessons, and anything else I usually say in a public sphere. And this has to do with the fact that I usually say, so it's always said, but now I'm making a point to repeat it. The information that I present is usually, I try to make it as representative as possible of the classic position of the method. And this is an important point. So a little bit of explanation around that. There is never going to be an issue where all of our scholars are going to agree 100% about all the details related to whatever question there is, whatever theme, topic, subject. There's going to be some divergence. Sometimes we can say, for instance, nowadays, if you come to the, let's say, 18th to 20th century, you might find almost a consensus between them, but if you go back 5 centuries ago, there were huge discrepancies between them. Sometimes it depends on their background or the theories they follow or what applies where and so on and so forth. In addition to that, and this is not to say that I'm a scholar at that level, but when I present information, I'm not giving my own personal opinion, usually. And I may have personal opinions about a lot of the questions I'm receiving. And it includes some of the questions that I got today. I do not think, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first has to do with the person speaking. First of all, we have to establish that this person is at the level where they should have an opinion or not about a religious matter. So before someone says, and this is my answer, we have to establish who are you to have an answer about this. That's one. So what are your credentials? What qualifies you as an expert in this? That's one. The second thing is, a lot of it has to do with the audience and the setting of the answer being given. So if we're in a setting where there might be people who, let's say they're new to religion, let's talk about religion specifically, but this applies to any field. A lot of these questions, let's say, have to do with, Islamic law, or they have to do with history, or if someone does not have the, let's say, the classic background, at least a good introduction to what the majority, the general consensus in Islam or in a specific school of thought is about a certain topic, then before we say, and this is my opinion, and I give it as though this is equal in importance and in value to the opinions of others, we have to make sure, let's say 80% or 90% of the experts in that field believe something. Well, I think it's more important to say what is the general, and that is worth something. To say that many of our scholars or experts in any field believe something. They may all be wrong, that's always a possibility. There might be room for innovation and room for progress and development and growth, but we can't jump into the very advanced topic or dimension or window of, and here's how we're going to innovate, before we have established first a foundation from which we can work. Okay, so I don't think usually we're in a setting where these are advanced discussions where everybody is on the same page in terms of their background and their basics, whatever field we're talking about, theology, history, or whichever other field. And usually the setting is not proper for that. So if we want to drill down into details, we need to be in a scientific setting. Before we say, this is my claim and this is my answer, I have to provide my proofs. And obviously this is going to contradict 10, 50, 200, 1,000 other arguments and proofs and details that others have put forward. So I have to be ready to go through them and explain why they are wrong, where they are lacking, where there's a shortcoming, and then add mine, right? So unless you're in that setting, and this applies here and applies elsewhere, be careful with the personal opinions. And if they are, then that's the last point I'll make, and then we'll start, I promise. The person who's giving their personal opinion needs to be very clear that they are giving their personal opinion. And they have to be very clear on, like, if this represents a 1 or 2% marginal opinion, as opposed to this is in line with, let's say, 80% or 90% of the scholars. And you're allowed and you have that freedom, but just make it clear so that the person receiving that information knows what they're working with. Okay, so keeping all that in mind. Question 1. I have heard when the women's veils were ripped off by Yazid's army, this refers to their faces being exposed rather than their hair. Is this true? So the short answer to this, and there were 2 questions about this, the second one is a little bit more detailed, but it goes a little bit outside of the historic question here. The other one is more related to Islamic law. So what is the proof, first of all? Why do we say that there was something that happened to the veils of the women who were with Imam Hussein alayhi salam? What is this based on? So perhaps one of the clearest indications of this is the sermon that we have from Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam in the palace of Yazid, where she mentions this word of hetk. Okay, hetk suturuhun. And I'll read the passage. Hetk is, we have to understand the literal meaning of the term hetk to understand what she's saying. So basically, as part of her sermon, the back and forth she had with Yazid, so this is after the events of the Karbala itself. On Karbala, they were taken back as captives, brought to Damascus, and then a number of series of back and forth, and then she delivered what can be considered a sermon. And as part of that, she tells Yazid, she speaks directly to Yazid, Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, and she says, Amin al-adl, yadna tulaqa, O son of the ones who were freed. So of course this is a reminder that his parents, his father and grandfather, had been freed by the Holy Prophet when he entered Mecca, and they had been his enemies trying to kill him for 20 years. Every opportunity they had, they tried to assassinate him and they waged wars against him. When he entered Mecca, he basically told them, you're all free, اذهبوا أنتم الطلقاء. Okay, you're free, you are the freed ones. And he just let them go. And so this is out of mercy, this is for all sorts of other reasons. Inshallah, one day we'll have an opportunity to discuss all these historic details. So she starts by telling him, is it justice from you, Yazid, son of those who had been freed? Okay, تخديرك حرائرك, so you are keeping your woman hidden behind closed doors. Is this justice that you do that with your own woman, but when it comes to the daughters of the Messenger of Allah, you are dragging them from one land to another by their enemies? And this is where these are the parts that are important. So سوقك بنات رسول الله سبايا, so they're dragged as captives from one place to another, prisoners or captives. And then she adds, قد هتكت ستورهن. That's the first part. That's perhaps the most direct one. قد هتكت ستورهن. You have, and so this is where we have to get a little bit into the details. What's hetk? Hetk in Arabic basically means to rip off. When something is ripped, it's mahtuk. So when it's applied to something that is metaphorical, that is not physical, then obviously it refers to kind of like a transgression against, an abuse of something. Okay, so what's sitr? Sitr is a veil. So we're not specifically talking, sitr here can mean something more metaphorical. Anything that veils, anything that prevents someone from seeing, an obstacle, a barrier, can become a sitr. Okay, so the term is not extremely explicit in what exactly is ripped off. Is she talking about the physical, what we refer to as the hijab, the headscarf, or the whatever falls under that category, or is it more, let's say, more general than that? But then the next passage may be a little bit more clear, because this is where she says, وَأَبْدَيْتَ وُجُوهَهُنْ. So now she goes into the specifics, and she says, and you have revealed, you have shown their faces. Okay, so now she gives us an indication of when their veils or their hijab had been removed, what is now being seen? What's being seen are their faces. Okay, and then she continues, تَحْدُوا بِهِنَّ الْأَعْدَاءَ مِنْ بَلَدٍ إِلَى بَلَدٍ, and so on and so forth. So the only clear indication we have is that their faces were now being seen. Which means what? Which means that their faces were not seen before. So the calamity here that Sayyidah Zainab is referring to is that their faces had never been seen, and now their faces were being seen. So this is one. Does it stop there? Of course not. So now we're looking at very specific things, but if we go a little bit backwards and take a step back and try to look at the context. These women, the women of the house of the Holy Prophet, they were women who had not been seen in public in general. They're not women that are usually seen doing things in public. They're usually seen in public when it's an extreme necessity. Otherwise, we have multiple narrations that say if they go out at night, they're surrounded by their men, no one really gets to them, no one sees them, and so on and so forth. So when you take that into consideration, you start understanding what she's referring to when she says hetk as-sitr, this transgression against their hijab. Their hijab is not simply the headscarf on their head or on their face. She's referring to they have been transgressed, they have been abused in this manner. These are not women who are usually in these contexts, and now they're being hit, they're being dragged from one land to another, they've been chained, they were put on the backs of camels, and you can imagine they're not being put like when they came with Imam Hussein as-salam, or when they would go with the Holy Prophet or Imam Ali. The women were usually in a small chamber that sits on top of a camel. You don't see what's inside of it. Okay, there's a barrier. It's very veiled, and this is considered, treating her with utmost honor and respect, and so on and so forth. And now they're just being dragged from one land to another as prisoners and as captives. So the issue here, Hatk al-Sitr, is all of that, but none of it goes as far as saying that, let's say, you could see them without the headscarf. No one has ever said that this is what is meant by it. And no historian has ever said that this is actually what happened during the time of Karbala or afterwards. Okay, so what's being referred to here is as in the context of the family of the Holy Prophet, the family of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, so their daughters, their wives, and so on and so forth, they had not been seen in that context, and all of that falls under Hatk al-Sitr. All of that falls under their hijab having been transgressed against. So it does not necessarily mean that their hijab was removed. The most we can say is, yes, they were treated as prisoners are treated, and they went as far as removing their niqab, that we would call it today, what covered their faces. Now, we're not necessarily saying that from this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, that we can establish that niqab is wajib. We're not saying that. But we're saying for those women, these are women whose faces had not been seen. And so Sayyidah Zainab, in the presence of Yazid, when she spoke in her sermon, that's the point that she made. She said, now everyone can look at their faces. And this had never happened before. And this is a calamity. So that gives you an idea of the context. Yeah.
So Sayyid, so can we use this argument when Sayyidah Zainab spoke clearly about seeing the faces? She didn't mention, let's say, the veil, the headscarf. Is a reply on the people who say that in the ziyarah they say Nashirat al-Shu'ur?
That's different.
Okay.
So that would require an explanation of where that is said in the ziyarah. So usually the point where this is said is when Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they received news that now the Imam was killed. So in Ziyarat al-Nahiya al-Muqaddasa, the Imam says, so they did this and this, and they went back, and they did this, and that, and they were Nashirat al-Shu'ur. They had opened their hair. Because the Arab woman of that time, culturally, when a woman is in that state of mourning, when she's mourning someone very close to her, she would open her hair. And she might move her head in a way that shows a sign of someone who is hopeless, desperate, no longer having patience, so not taking care of yourself enough to take care of your hair. So they would open their hairs. So these were Arab women. So culturally they were doing that. But the Imam does not say anyone could see them.
Exactly.
And so our scholars, when they've commented on this, they say they did this, but they did this inside their tents. So no one could see them doing that. But when Imam al-Hujjah Jaafar is saying this, well, he knows what happened. Whether, through a supernatural means or through whatever chain of transmission he has received from the Imams before him who have told him what had happened. But it does not necessarily mean that anyone saw them. So yeah, there is that expression as well. Okay, so that's the first question. The second question is, you mentioned the importance of learning history and the importance of choosing the right sources of knowledge. Therefore, from which sources should a person start learning history from? Okay, so we can make this into a long or a short answer. Let's keep it short for now, okay? And if we need more, we'll talk a little bit more. So the only thing I would add is, and if the person is here and they want to ask more or give me more detail, maybe I can give more of an answer. But let's say the person only speaks English, only reads English. In that case, for something like this, I recommend, for instance, the book, for instance, The Message of Sheikh al-Subhani as a good start. Okay? And in general, the books of Sheikh Jaafar al-Subhani are very, I'm going to say, balanced, extremely objective, extremely well researched. Does it mean that everybody agrees or I agree with every single detail of the book? Of course not. Okay, but generally speaking, as a book and as a heavyweight scholar who can give you authoritative information that is historical, I'm guessing the question here is about early Islam. And the reason I'm mentioning The Message is because it gives you the life of the Holy Prophet in detail. But to understand his life, you have to understand the nature of the tribal reality that he grew up in and that he was trying to change. And the book actually starts from there. If you have that, then at least you can start going in order and following that path. You go into the life of Imam Ali alayhi salam and the events that took place there, which will allow you to understand what happened to Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Because otherwise, if you just jump into, let's say, the life of Imam al-Baqir and you start understanding that he was there at the cusp between, right after or between the Umayyad and the Abbasids, and you don't know who these dynasties are, what they're trying to do and how they work and how are they different, and the strategies they use to get in, you're going to be lost and you're probably just going to give up or just skim over the information. So you should start from the beginning, and I'm guessing it has to do with the history of Islam. So I would say start from there. That will give you a very good background for the life of the Holy Prophet that is not, extensively detailed. It's, I believe, one large volume in English, the message. And with that, you should have a good background to continue. Some of the works, now I don't know, I used to have a list and it's not very present in my mind right now. I know some of the works of Sayyid Murtaba al-Askari have also been translated. Those books are usually very good in history. He's done a very good job and he's very objective, and he goes to the sources that everybody agrees on. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. He usually goes to the sources that everybody accepts in terms of Islamic history and Islamic theology, and where he disagrees, he explains it in detail and he takes his time, so it's very convincing. So in general, the historical and other works of Sayyid Murtaba al-Askari are very good resources too. I think that would be a very good start. That's one thing to say. If the person asking the question reads Arabic, then there is no the amount of resources at their disposal is enormous. The works of Sheikh Baqir Sharif al-Qarashi, if you want to read a good narrative of history without necessarily going into the technical aspect, so it's just told as an easy story to understand, and you just want to go through as a storytelling, the works of Sheikh Baqir Sharif al-Qarashi all fall into that. He has an encyclopedia about Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, I believe in 42, 43 volumes. And it has been translated fully in English, but I don't know if you're going to be able to find all of it or not. I've seen some volumes in English, and I know, for instance, the life of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is available in English from him. So, but if you read Arabic, then there are those, and there's other ones, like even outside of that encyclopedia, he has other works of history that are very good. That's another one. Generally speaking, also, if you read Arabic, I do recommend, there's a book. He doesn't really write that much about history, but he has a book called قادتنا كيف نعرفهم, Sayyid Ali al-Milani. So his area, I would say, of expertise is Sunna Shia debates. So it's a lot more theology. He has a ton of resources about that. But he does have that work that goes into the lives of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. It's in 4 volumes that covers all of the infallibles, the lives of the infallibles, but that one is only in Arabic, if you read Arabic. Yeah.
Sorry to cut you, the messenger that you spoke about in
The
English,
message, yeah.
The message, sorry, is it also suitable for people who are new to Islam or like basic?
Yes, definitely. Anyone can read that message. It starts from the beginning, you don't need any technical background, it reads like a story. And sometimes he will stop for like a paragraph or two and explain something in a little bit more detail, and then he'll go back to the story. But it reads like a story, of course, with some commentary and some remarks along the way. I think that's all I'll mention for now. If you can read Arabic, there's one work of 8 volumes. So if now we want to look just in Islamic history in general, there's the work of Sheikh Muhammad Hadi al-Gharawi al-Yusufi. Okay, he wrote an encyclopedia, let's call it, of 8 volumes. They're not gigantic. Okay, they're 8 normal volumes if you read Arabic. That basically covers the entire, it's called Tarikh al-Islami. So he's not specifically talking about the lives of Ahlul Bayt. So he's talking about Islamic history. So he often goes outside and comes back to their lives to explain the context, social, cultural, political context as well. And he covers probably 3-4 centuries from the beginning of Islam to, so it doesn't go until today. So for those, you'd have to go to other works. Then, of course, for the rest, I do not necessarily recommend for anyone to start reading the original sources of history unless you plan to become an expert in history. So if you want to become an expert, go back to the original sources. And the problem is you have to know how to read original sources, and you're going to see a lot of omissions, and you have to study manuscripts to see how many versions exist and which one are you reading, and then how do you put them together in a way to create so these scholars have done that work for you. But if you want to become a technical expert yourself, this is where you go to works like by At-Tabari or Ibn Kathir or Baladari or Ibn Asakir, and there's a ton of those. Okay, so that's depending on the level of expertise you want, you do that. Next question. In the first lecture, it was mentioned how the imams would show depression on their face and not smile, etc., only for 10 days, but not for the few days after it. For the captives, is there any reason why? I mean, it's because today we emphasize on the post-Ashura events too, and it's not recommended to do happy things for days or even weeks after Ashura. It seems it has become more traditional to do so, so shouldn't we stick to what the Imams used to do, only 10 days and that's it? Other than that, the single day martyrdom of the Imam. Okay, so short answer is yes. The istihbab, if we want to be technical about it, the istihbab would be for the first 10 days of Muharram, and we have other direct quotes that at least for the 9th and 10th you need to show your sorrow, express your mourning and your sorrow. That's if you want to be very technical about this. There are narrations, and we said, I believe we read one or two of them on the first night, where we said that you definitely have to show, and we have our imams showing it for 10 nights. So the 10 first nights of the month of Muharram. So why do we keep staying in this state of sorrow and mourning and sadness in general following the events of the 10th of Muharram? Should we not just go back to our lives in general? And I think for this, it deserves, it's worth to just spend like a couple of minutes to talk about when we say something is mustahab, what do we mean? So technically, let's just go back a step and say, whenever we say something is and we apply a hukum, so a hukum is either saying something is obligatory, something is prohibited, something is recommended, something is discouraged, or something is neutral. To say that, we need a proof. I cannot say something seems good, so it's recommended. I need a proof that says this is recommended. So when a faqih, when a legal scholar tells you this is mustahab, it's because they have a proof, direct proof that this is mustahab. So what do we mean by direct proof? Direct proof means they have a narration that they consider authentic, valid from the Holy Prophet or the Imams that says this specific action in this specific way is mustahab. This is where you apply istihbab. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So before I say something is mustahab, I have to see, do I have proof that it's mustahab? That's level one. Then we expand that circle a little bit and say, we have circumstances, we have situations where we do not have a direct proof, but we may have an indirect proof. So what do we mean by that? We may have a narration, for instance, that tells us, let's say when the Holy Prophet would sit before getting up to pray, he would often comb his beard. Okay? So let's put aside any narrations that we may have that say the Holy Prophet he would say comb your beard, it's recommended. Okay? Let's put that aside. We have narrations that say the Holy Prophet, intentionally taking a very simple example, the Holy Prophet would comb his beard before getting up to pray. That's it, that's all we know. We don't have a narration that says combing your beard is recommended. From this, if a scholar can establish that this was done not as a one-time thing, or it may be done at a one-time thing, but we can generalize it because it did not have to do with that specific context, or we can establish that he did this on a regular basis, then from there we can say, therefore this action is recommended. So anyone who wants to follow in the footsteps of the Holy Prophet can take this as a recommended action. We can't go from there and say it's an obligation because, that's discussed elsewhere. The Holy Prophet would never have not mentioned an obligatory action. So we can't say it's an obligation, but we can say if the Holy Prophet did it on a constant, regular basis, then we can infer from that this was a recommended action. It's something good to do, and you are most likely rewarded if you do it. Okay, that's the indirect way of establishing that. So let's call that indirect, but first level. But then we can go beyond that. And we say we're not talking specifically about something very concrete like this. We're talking about a general principle. So we read the Holy Quran, we read the life of the Holy Prophet or some of the narrations, and we have general rules, guidelines, and principles on how to live. So they tell us, be patient. When someone is having really bad manners with you and you're in a difficult situation, be patient. Use nice language. Don't sink to their level. Be the bigger person. We have a whole bunch of verses from the Quran that tell us this, and we have a ton more from the lives of Ahlul Bayt, whether it's direct quotes or just the manner in which they conducted themselves. From all of this, we establish a general principle that when you're in these types of situations where someone is lacking manners and disrespecting you, you should not sink to that level. And you have to remain with the highest level of conduct possible. So whenever someone is in that situation, through these indirect ways we can say, therefore it's recommended to not lose your temper and to have the higher manners and not lose them even if it is a difficult situation. Do we have a direct quote? No. We've just concluded and extracted a general principle that we now go to apply. And there's intentionally doing this, because when you go to a faqih, when you go to a legal scholar and you ask them, is this recommended? You have to know how they're answering you. And usually their answer has to do with only the first level. So they will tell you yes or no based on whether they have a direct quote from the Prophet or the Imam saying this action is recommended. If they don't, they say this, I don't have proof for that. So I'm not going to claim from myself, out of my own pocket, that this is recommended. Okay. That said, there's a general rule that a lot of our scholars follow, not all of them, some of them have rejected this rule, but there's a general principle that has to do with all recommended actions. And this falls in legal Islamic theory. They call it al-tasamuh fi adillat as-sunnah. So flexibility in the proofs for recommended actions. Which means what? Which means that so long as your intention is good, you're doing this for the right reasons, a faqih should not be telling you don't do this. Your intention is good, and generally speaking there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. Whether I have proof that what you're doing is a directly quoted action that is recommended or not, let's put that aside. Your intention is good, you're doing a good thing, it obviously has a benefit to you, it has a benefit to other people, just keep doing it. Why are you trying to dig to see, is there an established proof that this is a good action, recommended action? Just do your good thing. You believe it's a good thing and it's recommended, keep doing it. So with everything we've said, we may not have direct quotes and direct proofs that Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam have said keep the state of mourning and sorrow and sadness beyond the 10 days of Muharam. We may not have that. Although indirectly we may establish it. But let's say we don't have it. But then we do have general guiding principles that fall under very important themes. Themes like the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, mawadda, right? The Holy Quran talks, إِلَّا الْمَوَدَّةَ فَالْقُرْبَى. The love of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, the qurba, the relatives of the Prophet in Surah Al-Shura. For instance, we have al-wala. So having this very strong ideological and emotional link to Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, the infallibles, prophets and infallibles. Okay, so if you are someone who feels very attached, very close to a principle or very attached to a person, and this is the situation that you're in, well, this is your chance to show it. And this is where we have to add. The month of Muharram generally does not really have many happy occasions. It just happens that way. Okay, there's a few questionable instances of narrations that say on the first, on the second, on the third, this happened to that prophet, this happened to, and I always say, if we are able to establish the validity of those narrations, because there's a very strong possibility that all of these were created after the tragedy of Karbala to create a reason why people should be happy during this time. It's funny that the rest of the year no one talks about anything related to the prophets, but when it comes to the 10 days of Muharram, suddenly everybody's talking about, Musa alayhi salam or Isa or Yusuf or. So that's one thing. There are no real reasons to be very happy. That's one. Two, in the month of Muharram, if you understand the history of the events, and we just talked about it, the events did not really end with the killing of the Imam. The taking of all of his family members as captives, all the way to Damascus and so on and so forth, continued. So if you're aware and you're still living that moment, it's difficult just to fall back into your regular routine and forget about that. If you're really someone who's into that, you understand the history and the sequence of events. You really understand what happened. You can't just put all of that aside and go back to your happy life. That's the second thing. The third thing I would say is, yes, there's definitely a cultural thing, but the cultural thing does not come out of the blue. It's related to the points we mentioned. Here in a country where you're a complete minority, you're completely secluded, you don't really see it. But if you were, let's say, to go to a place where there's a majority of Shia, you go to one of the, you go to Najaf or Karbala, or you go to a Hawza, for instance, you'll see just being in a context where everybody continues with the remembrance of Ahl Bayt and specifically Imam Hussein, and it's as simple as seeing people wearing black. Nothing else is happening, but you see them wear black. So culturally, this has become associated in Islam with mourning and sorrow and so on and so forth. You see that continue at least for the entire month of Muharram, and usually for the entire month of Muharram and Safar. And in those milieus and those contexts, it's very rare that anyone would dare not remove the black before at least the 40-day mark, so the 20th of Safar, and usually it goes at least to the last Wednesday, because in our narrations it might have been the day that the Holy Prophet passed away, the last Wednesday of the month of Safar. So that brings us all the way to the end of the month of Safar. Okay, so before that day, it's very rare, and that's why when you look at it, you see the series, a sequence of events, and it's one sad, tragic event after another, and the culmination of it is the passing away of the Holy Prophet, which if you read the ziyarat, of the Immat of the Holy Prophet, they say there is no greater calamity that has ever happened, and that's true. Everything else that followed is the result of the Holy Prophet no longer being there, no longer being in control, and everything else is just like dominoes that continue to fall one after the other. So if you keep that in mind, that's why it's considered one big season of mourning and sorrow. Do we have proofs? No, but these are the indirect reasons why this might be. Yeah.
Did the Imams or Sayyidah Zainab not do things after the 10th every year, and so that we could infer that it's kind of recommended because they're doing it?
Yes.
Or what about the Ziyarat al-Arba'in? Is that not recommended also?
Yeah, so I did not intentionally want to go into all those details, because this is where our scholars are going to differ. So while some scholars say that this is clearly established, Ziyarat al-Arba'in, others say that it was added later. And so it's more for cultural reasons that it was added, but not in this specific manner. As for the events related to Karbala, that's also, there's disagreement between the historians on when did they actually go back to the city of Medina. So was it actually exactly 40 days? Because in some history books, they say that trip actually took 1 year. It was not 40 days. It took 1 year from them to go from Karbala to go back to Medina. And that's why she was, in some narrations, Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam was unrecognizable. Because she had been away from Medina, away from her house, and those very difficult, captivity situation for a year. And this is why she was unrecognizable. It was not a month or a month and a half, even though that can be enough to change someone's appearance completely, given everything that she went through. But it might have been more. So the 40-day mark may have been put there more as a symbolic date that represents all of that, including not only the killing, but the return of the captives all the way to Medina. Okay?
Or is it just the return of the hand, the 40 days?
And so, yes, and even that, there's, how many different opinions there are. And again, I'm not saying which one, I'm not saying this is the one or this is not the one. All of our scholars, no one has ever objected to the Arba'in being extremely important. Or whether it's the walk, whether it's the ziyarah, whether it's
reasons.
Yeah, that's not. But the least we can say, so even if someone wanted to say this, my proof is not 100% reliable that this is what it happened, you still do it for everything else that it represents. And the majority of people consider it to be completely reliable, right? So there's no issue with that in that manner. Did it happen in that sequence? That's the issue. Or was that put in place later? What I wanted to add is, if that's the case, and what we will want to rely on is, let's say, majalis, or the gatherings that started to take place in Medina and elsewhere, and there's a question about that, so I was keeping it for later, those were not limited to the 40 days. Those started to take place in regularly and constantly and for a very long time. They continued way beyond the 40-day mark. We have Rawah for 2 to 3 years, she sat in mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi. She refused to ever be under a roof, ever, to sit under a roof. If there's a sun, she wants her body to be burned by the sun after everything that happened to Imam Hussein, the wife of Imam Hussein, Rabah, okay, and others. So the constant state of mourning remained with Ahl al-Bayt, especially the ones that came back to Medina, as well as the ones after. It did not stop at the 40-day mark. And that's why I'm specifically talking about the answer. The question is, why do we continue? Well, if you want to follow Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam, Imam Zayn al-Abidin did not change, before or after Safar. In our narrations, until he passed away, there's no food that was brought to him that he did not mix with his tears. No drink was given to him that did not have his tears fall into it. Okay, so this is for 40 years. This is for 30 some years after the events of Karbala. He did not stop. Okay, and people were afraid of him. They thought he would die. They thought he would go blind. They thought he was hurting himself too much. And all of his companions, Abu Hamza al-Thumali and others, they would come and they would tell him, you're exaggerating. This is too much. Take care of yourself. And then, of course, he would remind them of the tragedy. And so if we want to follow what Ahl al-Bayt did, it's more than the 40-day mark. It's the entire year. And it continued, especially close to the events. Because those events, of course, they were sad. That's one thing. And you're trying to mourn them, but the strategic reason for that is you need to spread this. So how are you going to spread it? You have to be in constant remembrance of these events so that they actually spread. Otherwise, it's going to stay contained to the people of Medina, the captives who came back, and it'll stop with them. But then you saw that, no, it started spreading from Kufa, Medina, Damascus, and so on and so forth. And yes, it has been constantly reminded of or remembered until now. It has never stopped. Okay, was there a question or what you can?
No, just.
Okay. Sorry. Was there a specific strategy for leaving some people behind in Medina, or they just couldn't make it? If so, name some examples. I'm not sure of the accuracy of this one example. al-Baneen was left behind. Okay. Amongst the first Majlis reciters, so she would have become one of the first Majlis reciters, which carried on to be a tradition until today. So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily everybody who stayed behind in Medina or elsewhere. I think the question could be spun a little bit to say, is there a reason why, was there a good reason for why some people that we thought should have probably been as part of the caravan of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, how come were they not in that caravan? Why were they absent from the events of Karbala?
Like his brother, for example.
Yeah, so some of the people, for instance, there's a whole lot of them, and that requires, honestly, we would need to look at each one of them individually, because some of them had good reasons and some of them did not. Or some of them may have had, but we have no idea why they were not there. Let's say, for instance, a lot of people say that Ibn Abbas was very close to Imam Hussein, and he came and he advised the Imam, and the Imam told him, I know that you're giving me very good counsel. You're sincere in the advice you're giving me not to go, and I thank you for that. So obviously the relationship was good, and the Imam is talking in a very nice, virtuous, righteous way with Ibn Abbas. So why wasn't Ibn Abbas with the Imam? He's part of Bani Hashim, he's very close. He knows more than anyone the status of Imam Hussein. Why is he not there? And a lot of people say by that time Ibn Abbas had become blind. And that's the reason why he didn't join. Ibn al-Hanafiyyah, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, a lot of historians say he had been injured and he could not travel. Whether he could walk or not, travel would have been very difficult for him. Jaafar ibn Abi Talib, for instance, Abdullah ibn Jaafar ibn Abi Talib, the husband of Sayyidina Zainab alayhi salam. In some narrations, it seems that the Imam had actually given him responsibilities. He had given him money to take care of the people, basically the Shia and in the general world, those who come to the Imam for all sorts of reasons. Basically, Abdullah bin Jaafar played the role of the treasurer of Ahlul Bayt during his time. Even before his time and his time. He was a very wealthy man and he used his wealth for righteousness. And the Imam would have given him a responsibility to play that role while he's away. Okay, so some people seem to have been given specific roles. al-Banin specifically, because she's mentioned in the question, a number of reasons can be given. One reason can be that we are told, for instance, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam, he left his youngest child, and perhaps more, but we know at least of his youngest child with her. Okay, so that's one. And of course, we're told when they came back, the captives, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam raised him, the son of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, until he reached a certain age, and then he gave him his daughter Khadija to marry. And that continued the line of, anyways, so through the line of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam, through his youngest child, who had remained with al-Banin to take care. Others have said that she took care also of Fatima al-Alila, the daughter of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, who was ill and could not go with the Imam the caravan. And here, you know, like in 30 seconds, I can add that in certain narrations and in certain historical analysis,
She doesn't exist.
well, some people say she doesn't exist. I disagree with that. I think oftentimes the person we hear about from the minbar seems to be a young girl who got sick. If you go to some of the riwayat of Ahlul Bayt, they speak of a woman, she's not a child, that Imam Hussein alayhi salam had an older daughter by the name of Fatima, and she may be the same person or not, I don't know. She may be the same person that is referred to in some narrations as Fatima al-Kubra. So when you see Fatima al-Kubra, sometimes they say that person doesn't exist because of the way that person is presented. They say Imam Hussein, when he left Medina, he actually left a will and a lot of responsibility to this oldest of his daughters that she would have given back to Imam Sajjad when he came back. This is not a child in Medina. This is a grown woman who played a very important role at a very difficult time. Just like Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. For being sick, this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how he architectured the event, let's say. For that entire mission to continue, there are certain people who could not be part of this caravan to continue the role and to continue the school of Ahlul Bayt in this manner. And so Fatima al-Kubra, if that is the person, in some narrations, Imam Hussein says this is the person who looked the most like Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. That person would have been the one who would have stayed behind, and al-Banin would have stayed behind to take care of her and to take care of the child of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. And of course, we can add to that other conclusions. But those conclusions may not be as historically, direct historical analysis. It may be more conjecture from our parts. To say, maybe it would have been too much for her to handle, that she lost 4 of her sons, including Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. Others have said that she would have thought that Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas is too busy with everything else going on to take care of her. So she does not want to become that burden on Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas to take care of her during that trip. There's other interpretations that were given for why al-Banin specifically was not part of that caravan. But those at least we know for sure. There was Fatima al-Alila that stayed behind, that's one. And 2, there was the child of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas who was mentioned when they returned to al-Madinah that she's carrying a child. Well, that's the son of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, so she's the grandmother carrying that child. As for, the question also says, she would have been the first to establish majalis. It depends how we interpret that. If you go back in history and we believe our narrations, then we know that the majalis of Imam Hussein started with Adam alayhi salam and continued to the Holy Prophet, and the Holy Prophet himself had a majlis for the Imam when the Imam was born. Right? And everybody started crying instead of being happy for the birth of Imam Hussein because he told them what would happen. It started then and there. But let's say for after the events, the historic events, the historic sequence, I wouldn't say necessarily, I think it's we have to be accurate. We can't say she was the first to recite majalis. They all recited majalis. They all created this gathering to remember Imam Hussein right from the time they came back in Medina and onwards. So that included al-Baneen, that included Zainab, that included al-Rabab, that included the wives of the companions of the Imam, and generally speaking, the Shia and the Imams afterwards, Imam al-Sajjad to the others. Okay, so that's fourth question. I took too long for the first questions. Let's go a little bit faster. Why did Imam Ali alayhi salam keep Shuraih al-Qadi if he's not reliable when he's being bribed? This led to the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Is it because it's not fair to remove someone from their post from an unconfirmed future and can only be judged on the literal material, not the hidden, as long as he wasn't doing anything wrong? So, technically, absolutely. First answer is, Shuraih had not done anything wrong by then. The wrong and the accepting of bribes and all of that only started later. So it's unfortunate for someone who spent that much time really playing that important role of being an objective, competent judge under, that many governments, and everybody refers to him as competent and qualified and righteous, suddenly starts being so cheap as to accept bribes and play the roles that he played. That's the first reason. The second thing that we have to add here, and this is important because it applies way beyond just Shuraih, is that of course when the Imam comes into power, he cannot completely uproot everything that exists. Just like the Holy Prophet couldn't uproot everything that exists and create something new from scratch overnight. This takes time. The Imam, and we can't go into the details here, but there are tribal reasons, there are political reasons, there is competence reasons. If I remove everybody who has experience playing a certain role, so everybody is completely junior in their position, well, my government won't work. And you can see that anywhere in the world. And as we have said again and again, all these things work based on the normal laws of nature and the cause and effect of the world. The Imams do not use miracles to run a government or to... You put the qualified person in that job and they may make mistakes and they may not. Yeah.
So, based on that explanation,
yeah.
Ali went to Kufa, he wanted to remove Muawiyah. And people came to him and told him, don't do it, instead keep him around for a year or two. And then, little by little, increase his power, and then, you know better than me about that. But Imam Ali, he wanted to remove Muawiyah so badly.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, he put Ziyad ibn Abi to Fars or Qais ibn Ash'ath to Azerbaijan. So this controversy that these people, even Ziyad ibn Abi had financial issues. Ibn Abbas, when he put to Basra, the controversy in Nahr al-Balagha, it's just a famous one. So the question is, why Imam Ali did not went easy on Ibn Abbas or Ziyad ibn Abi and Qais ibn Ash'ath when he was in Azerbaijan, but didn't go easy on Muawiyah when he was in Sham?
So Muawiyah, basically, there is nothing left to spin into something positive. The way Muawiyah worked, it was all in the open. It's not in the open in the sense of Yazid. His son was out in the open with fisq. Muawiyah was out in the open with the trickery, the political way to get to his established goals. The people that he was killing, the people that he was bribing, the manner in which he reached his rule, everybody in that time understood what was going on. The reason why he stayed in power is, one, because he knew how to use money, two, because he knew how to create tribal alliances, but no one would come and say Muawiyah is a righteous man. So the Imam can remove him based on that. The others, they haven't done anything yet. When they make mistakes, these are mistakes that we can deal with on a material basis. You make this mistake, this is forgivable. You agree that this was a mistake, you never do it again, here I can forgive you. You've made a mistake, but that one is unforgivable, he removes him as a governor. And he did that in certain situations, and he forgave others in other situations. So he dealt with everything based on a material way. Of course, we always have to know, we add that the Imam knows more than the material. Of course that's there. But if we want to bring it down just to the historical analysis, there is enough to say there's an open war. Muawiyah, basically, he openly declared war with the person that everybody gave a bay'ah to as the Khalifa. This had never happened before in Islam. He was openly saying, I'm going to create a dynasty. I'm going to return the Khilafah into Bani Umayyah and make Bani Umayyah great again. Just like they were in the time of it. He was open with that. And with Uthman gave him so much rope because he was Umayyi. He gave him so much flexibility and he gave him so much room to work that things had reached such a point that it's a point of no return. The Imam has to enter into the battle with Muawiyah. Muawiyah is not pretending to be, he tried, but no one was convinced of that. Everybody knew politically what Muawiyah was doing. With the others, I think in a lot of cases the Imam was still able to absorb them and use them for something that we can call a greater good. If someone is in a position, let's say the Imam needs a strong warrior or a strong political mind or and those people have that competence, and the Imam does not think that they're going to betray him or betray Islam in general in those positions, he's going to let them work that way. And maybe this is an excuse Yawm al-Qiyamah that will show how many chances did we give you to get back here. So historically, I think this is one way to explain it. Excellent question. Question 6. Is it true that there are opinions that the hijab of Sayyidah Zainab was taken off? So I think we answered that one. And then the rest of the questions actually talks about the hijab in general. It's a longer question, so I'm just going to go a little bit faster. To be more specific, hijab actually khimar and jilbab itself is wajib, but the details of it is not 100% clear, at least not in the narrations. In fact, we do not have any risala on hijab itself. You see extensive salat rules, you see extensive khums rules, you see even detailed discussions on trading, transaction, but yet when it comes to hijab, it seems as if there isn't sufficient proof for the detailed info about the hijab. Only 2-3 reliable narrations talk about it. It's quoted, so I'm quoting it. And even those narrations do not clearly show if the full hijab is wajib, we see today, but rather at the most very mustahab. Okay. I'm going to try to avoid repetition of what was said in the lecture about hijab.
So
the reason why there is no... Yeah, so there was one lecture where we talked about this...
Second lecture, just for if someone wants to refer to it.
I don't remember the
Okay,
order.
I think
That's good.
the second lecture, if anyone wants to refer to it, Sayyid Jaafar replied to some arguments that say the hijab is not wajib.
Yeah, so the manner in which we presented it, we concentrated on the verses of the Quran. We said we don't have time to go through all the narrations and all the proofs that have been given for why the hijab is wajib. Okay, but we said if it's established and we can establish it through the Quran, then that should be sufficient, at least as a starting point. So that's one thing. The reason why there are no detailed discussions about the hijab. First of all, so I'm going to answer it in two ways. For argument's sake, let's say there are no detailed discussions about the hijab. If that is the case, that is because up until very, very recently, all the scholars of Islam for 14 centuries have been unanimous that the hijab is wajib. It's like there is no risala that has ever been written to say salah is wajib. Because everybody is unanimous. They consider that as, they call it in fiqh, daruriyat ad-din. These are the essentials, meaning that if you don't believe in them, you're not a Muslim. Okay? That used to be the case for hijab. Up until recently, with the attacks that came on Islam from the outside first, they were not Muslims. No Muslim ever raised the issue of hijab until it was attacked from outside of Islam. And then slowly the same arguments started creeping into Islam with some scholars of Islam who started following the same path. Until today, we don't have really scholars of Islam who say it's not hijab. Some people, but they're not accepted as scholars of Islam. Okay, they don't have a scholarly background of Islam. They studied Islam, but not, let's say, in an institution of Islam. They haven't studied in Mecca or studied in Azhar or studied in Najaf and come out and said there's no proof. It's just a matter of time, I'm sure, but until now and to my knowledge, this has never happened. Although some people who are recognized in the world as experts on Islam have said the hijab is not wajib, following in the same path. What Orientalists and some anthropologists have said, the distinction between being a slave and being not a slave and things like that. Okay? So that's already an argument on its own, that there has never been a single scholar in Islam for 14 centuries who has ever questioned the validity of the obligation of the hijab. If someone can show that, I need proof. Yes?
I was going to clarify the question. Nobody, I don't think anybody, well, people doubt that hijab is wajib, but I'm not the person not asking, not specifically asking what kind of hijab.
Yes, so I'll get to
Oh,
that.
I'm gonna get,
That's the first layer.
Okay.
Okay? The second layer is to say that there are no works on the hijab. No, there are actually some detailed technical works on hijab. So what is researched? As we said, if something is considered unanimously understood by all scholars, no one is going to waste their time writing about it. That's why I'm saying now it's probably going to start soon at some point, that some scholar is going to say, okay, it's worth my time to actually sit and write something about this that should be so obvious. Okay? It will happen eventually. And it has started a little bit. What has been researched though is the extent of the hijab. What is the hijab? That has been. But what is the question? What's the question that they research? And I will drill it down to something very concrete, and we already mentioned. The biggest question about all the scholars of Islam, anyone who is a faqih in Islam, that question, they do research it. Throughout 14 centuries it's been researched and it continues, and that one is not unanimous. Do women have to cover their faces or not? That's where there's a discussion and there's a disagreement.
Of the face, sorry.
The face covering. And we have some of our scholars all the way to Sayyid al-Khou'i, okay, for those who follow, and Sayyid al-Khou'i had ihtiyat wujubi, that a woman, either you do taqleed of someone else in this mas'ala, or you cover your face. Okay. So, this is up until now, and it continues, and it has not stopped. And there are people who say this is a proof for it, and this is not the proof for it. Okay? This is if you want to understand the classic theory. It's not that there is no discussion, but that's the discussion. If anyone wants to go back to the fuqaha and see what they are discussing, it's not that, is the hijab wajib? What they're discussing, so when you go back and you find someone like Al-Albani, okay, so this is a Salafist, literal interpretation, as staunch as possible, and so on and so forth. He goes through every single proof that has ever been given on all sides, and he concludes, at the end of this, it's like, I wish I could tell my daughters and my wife, I wish I could tell them that it's wajib to cover your face, but I cannot. That's his conclusion. Okay? And it means something because Saudi is relying on people like him and others for their fatwa. Okay? All of that to say, is there unanimity or not? Today, I would say it's different. Over the past maybe 40, 50 years, new arguments are being introduced. So there might be some scholars who need to get back into the discussion and address those new arguments directly. Historically, this has never been the case in Islam. There are some people who have tried to show, no, it's very easy. Go back to the verses of the Quran that we presented in the lecture and read the commentaries of the Quran, and you will start seeing some of the narrations. Now in the question, we have 1 or 2 or 3 reliable narrations. That's not the case. There are dozens upon dozens of narrations. So some of them are direct and some of them are not direct. Let's say you go to a book like Wasa'il al-Shia, for instance. Wasa'il al-Shia, that is a book that narrates the ahadith that have to do with every chapter, every topic of fiqh. If you put all the topic related to hijab, so is it permissible or not to look at the hair of a woman? Does the woman have to cover or not? What can you see from a woman? So these are different headings under the big chapter, but that chapter together has between 40 and 50 narrations. So no one can come back, when you put these together, all of these have to be studied before you say, is there a hijab? And is it wajib? And what is the extent of the hijab? No one can come back and say there were only 2 to 3 and they're questionable. All of this needs to be studied in addition to, that's why we said, we can't go through the narrations. Because going through the narrations requires, an extensive study. But at least from the verses of the Quran, that's what we establish. That's the second. Third thing is, there is more than just these direct narrations. As we said, you have to look at the indirect. There are narrations that are not specifically talking about the hijab, but there's a mention in the hijab that kind of implies, or from which you can infer the conclusion that the hijab is wajib. That's another one.
Like the Chinese traveler, for example.
For, sorry?
Like the Chinese traveler that you mentioned in the
For
lecture.
instance, but no, I'm talking about in the riwayat. So if you see, for instance, we have a narration that tells us how Fatima al-Zahra dressed when she went to give her sermon. Okay, well, the narration has nothing to do with the obligation of the hijab. But for someone who considers Fatima al-Zahra's actions as a hujjah, as a proof, then that becomes an indirect proof. Why would she dress in that manner? So here, but this is the job of the faqih that I will not do here, that to tell you, is this something that you can generalize into an Islamic law, or is this something specifically related to this person, or this instant, or this space and time?
Yeah,
Okay.
because you mentioned earlier in the question you said that to make it clear that wajib, had to clearly say it that the action, and that he does it every time, but even then, is it only limited to the very Hassan, right? There's a lot of questions around here there,
So if, for instance, someone says this is limited to Bani Hashim, I need something that says this is limited to Bani Hashim.
and if it doesn't mean everybody, it applies to everybody else.
Well, the verses of the Quran that we presented are open. If you are a believing woman, then this applies to you.
The Quran says hijab, but
No, it doesn't say hijab. The hijab is something else. It says khimar or
I'm talking
jilbab.
about the khimar and the jilbab, I'm talking about that, sorry. But the reason I know the lecture is that they put over, but the narration say that, or the just interpretation of the word itself and the tafsir, or did the Mufassir put like a proof of the narration?
No, you have, in the narrations, you start seeing a lot more detail.
Okay.
So how we defined khimar and jilbab, you see it in detail in the narrations. And it's dozens of narrations. As I said, like at least between 40 and 50 narrations could be given for that, at least. It's a good study. You're making me think that I should write a little article about that and put
Yeah,
them.
it'd be nice.
Okay, I had more to say about this, but let's keep it to that.
So say
Yeah.
because there's only 2-3 minutes for
Yes.
salat, so it's better maybe about this question because you already answered. Does the sister has any follow-up question about that? Just feel free because we won't
Yeah.
stop on this question.
I would appreciate an article that you
A
mentioned.
little article with some of the narrations. So if we do that, because I don't think I have time to write a book about this, so we can't go through them and do an analysis of the narrations, but we can certainly provide dozens of narrations where the hijab is mentioned. Now those would have to be scrutinized and analyzed to see are they authentic or not, what do they actually mean, how do they interpret it, and so on and so forth. Okay, but just compiling them, yeah, it's possible. Inshallah, I'll add that to the
Feel
list.
free to ask if you have anything to share. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, let me just see very quickly the questions that we had. There was a question here, so I'm gonna just ask you guys if you feel like it. Maybe we can add one more week just to deal with these. There was a question that said, what is the role that you claim for Islam and how you justify its interference with its followers' lives? So the question is very loaded. We don't claim a role for Islam, as no religion claims a role for itself in that manner. If you believe in a God and you believe that He sent a message, then you openly choose to follow those teachings, and you would not call those teachings interference with its followers' lives. You would say the followers have chosen a certain lifestyle that is Islamic, so Islam is not interfering. And if you believe that Islam is comprehensive to all aspects of life, then you're going to believe that it's going to have teachings and guidelines for every aspect of their lives. And they are free to choose to follow them or not, but we would not call that an interference or claim a role for it in that manner. Anyways, question 8, how do you respond to the claim that Islam is not a copycat of other philosophies and religions? People who come from a comparative religions background want only to rely on material causes when they look at a phenomenon. So if they say, where does Christianity come from? Well, they're going to study the social, cultural, historical milieu context, and they're going to say, here's what someone who tries to bring this type of thought would have borrowed, consciously or not, from others to create this. Okay, so this is a very materialistic way of interpreting. We can write a book about this. And what we believe, and I think people who want to study these religions objectively, our claim is that all of these religions are coming from the same source. If there's a new religion, and inshallah we're going to go into that in our theology lessons on prophethood, the reason why a new religion is being sent is two reasons. One of them is that we believe there are so many distortions that have taken place with the previous religion that you need something to come and put you back on the right path because you've gone off track. That's one. Two, the reason why there's a new religion being sent is that humanity has evolved to a point where its social and individual needs can no longer be met by the guidelines that were sent before. So you need a new set of guidelines that are more nuanced and more mature and that can help human beings in the next phase of their evolution. So this is why we believe Islam was sent. So for someone to come back and say, how do you claim it's not a copy? So maybe Islam comes back and 50% of it matches what we find in Judaism, or 80% of it, that's fine. There's no issue with that. If the source is the same and it's all coming from God, it does not necessarily mean that our Prophet went and picked and chose things here and there in Judaism or Zoroastrianism or Buddhism or Christianity and created a religion for himself. So that's one way to interpret it. Another way to interpret it is, as we say, the source is the same, and there are parts of those laws and those divine religions that are still fine and compatible, and those Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala maintained in place. And the rest, because either distortions happen or it's now outdated, we have a new religion, and so this is a discrepancy. And I'm not going to go there to see what I pick and choose. I have to go back 100% to Islam to see what it kept in place and what it removed and what it changed. It kept with a change. And this is where I see what this religion says, and not necessarily but intentionally trying to draw it back every piece to see to what extent does it match what I find in other religions, and therefore the cliched, but that can be explained about everything that a human being goes through, whether it's religion or philosophy or theory or whatever. Like they say, philosophy was created in ancient Greek. No, it's not. All of those philosophers studied either in Egypt or Babylon or elsewhere, and they came back with those thoughts. So nothing is created from nothing. It comes from human thought that spreads and is borrowed. Okay, so the same thing is going to apply here. That's only if you want to rely entirely on only materialistic interpretations. But if you add a divine component, which I think you have to be open to it at least, then you don't need to trace it back. As for the rest, this would require an extensive study. Can Islam claim validity for its theories on logical bases while it uses a lot of compiled hypotheses to prove a point? I don't know what that means. Everything, whether it's science or philosophy or anything that you create, requires what they call in the philosophy of science axioms. An axiom is a thing that goes without, you cannot establish a proof, or you do not need to establish a proof to start with. You cannot establish a proof for the law of non-contradiction, that something can be and not be at the same time. There's no proof for that. It's so evident for the human mind that you cannot really establish a genuine proof for it. Anyway, so that's called an axiom. In other words, Ahlul Kalam, to establish a point, they drown you in assumptions. Well, not more than anyone would in philosophy or natural science or elsewhere. Okay, so that's how human thought works. You build on previous conclusions, and those conclusions need to be established based on logic and reason and whichever other proofs you have. So in the case of a religious person, one of your proofs, in addition to your reason, is what comes from revelation. Yeah.
Maybe the question was like going to this direction.
Yeah.
For example, in Bab al-Imama.
Yeah.
Like different Ahlul Kalam have different theories, and Al Majlis, when he comes to discuss the concept of Imama, he takes in your consideration, you must believe that there is a just God, and then he thinks, okay, you have to assume that there is a prophet, and the prophets, each one of these arguments that he brings are assumptions, they're not solid theories.
Yeah, so this is where
you can poke him everywhere. So the Imam is going to fall apart if
you're completely right. So if you jump into, and this is why, like anyone who's following the lessons that we're giving in theology, you'll see that this is not how the proof is established. So the way we're building, we have a weekly theology class, and in there we're trying to show how actually these proofs we've started from scratch and we're building on them. We haven't reached Imam. So while to prove that there's an Imam, you need to prove that there's a God and there's a prophet and that he's just and I agree with you. But these are not assumptions that are based on not reason. So you have to give the chance to the person claiming this belief to explain it to you from the beginning, and you'll see they're not empty assumptions. There is a logical, objective proof evidence for each one of these parts. There is a logical proof that there is a God, a logical proof that He is just, logical proof for prophethood, and then when you reach imamah, it's all logical. It just derives one from the other. So, yeah.
The problem is, when he's talking about imam, I'm not talking about imam as a theological thing.
Yeah.
When Hakalakini talks about imamah, he's talking about the political structure of imamah. But he wants to prove it as a let's say, structure that, let's say, the Christian under that, in the realm, should believe in imamah. Or like, not believe, it should be, it's under imamah.
Yeah, that's not logical.
How do you justify it?
You
like,
cannot.
How do you justify, for example, the current government, you can justify it somehow. Right?
No, but so basically,
basically,
it's not logical to expect. I cannot go to someone who doesn't believe, let's say, in the Quran to start with, and I tell him Imam al-Sadiq says this, therefore you have to believe it. That's not logical. So if Allama Majlisi does that, and I don't know if he does or not, but if he does that, that's not logical. You cannot expect someone to accept an argument for which you have not established all they call them premises. Every premise has to have been established. And this requires another discussion. Give me one minute and I'll finish. The two last questions I had one of them was about Hujr ibn Adi, and where was he in the Saqifa? So that's a very interesting question. Very quickly, Hujr ibn Adi became a Muslim perhaps 2 years before the life of the Prophet. The Prophet passed away. So he didn't spend a lot of time with the Prophet. He would have been between 26 and 28 when the Holy Prophet passed away. At that time, unless you're someone who is very recognizable, people don't talk about you because you're too young. That's 2. 3, Hujr ibn Adi, when he entered into Islam, he left and went back to Kufa. So he was not in Medina for all of these events. But from the beginning, all the narrators, all the historians tell us that he was a staunch, close supporter of Imam Ali alayhi salam from the moment he entered into Islam and all the way until his martyrdom. That's one thing. The last question I had was about whether Ibn Marjana, who's mentioned in Ziyarat Ashura, is it the same person as Ibn Ziyad? Because the Ziyarah says, Ubaydullah bin Ziyad wa ibn Marjan, Ziyarat Ashura. So, if it's not the same person, or is it the same person, what do we do with that? The scholars who accept that part of the Ziyarah say, and I don't have time to explain what I'm saying right now, they say that these two words are the same person. The waw, so Ibn Ziyad wa ibn Marjana, the Ziyarah is referring to the father and the mother of the person intentionally to make sure you know who we're talking about. Ubaydullah is the son of Ziyad, and Ubaydullah the son of Marjan, his mother. So it's to establish for sure who we're talking about. So it's an explanatory and not a conjunction in the sense that this is one person is called Ibn Ziyad and another is Ibn Marjan. This is the same person being referred to in 2 different ways. So it's not 2 different people. And there's more explanation that we give in here, but that's a short answer.